this up to people. All right, so as people are coming in, oh, I should change my name here so people know who I am. So as people are coming in, we're going to keep with the 10-minute time limit for our presenters. If you have any questions, we'll save Q&A for the end. Please post any questions you have for any of our panelists in the Q&A box at the bottom. And like I said, we'll address those at the end. We're also going to go in order of the program. So our first paper today, it's in the nature of all femoids to want to be violently taken. That said, Albina, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. The floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you shared your screen and then it
Yes, I am going back right now.
okay.
All right, can you see everything pretty well?
Mm-hmm.
Great, so my name is Albina Laskovtsov, and I am going to be presenting on incels or involuntary celibates today. The title of my presentation, I actually pulled a direct quote from some of my data. And so, yeah, it's in the nature of all femoids to want to be violently taken. With that being said, I do want to provide a language warning. There's going to be mention of sexual assault, death, and other acts of violence, as well as just overall disturbing language throughout the presentation. So I'm going to provide just a brief literature review about just 3 parts of my project: gender and online spaces, digital violence against women, and involuntary celibate. So literature tells us that women and girls experience disproportionate harassment and abuse online. And of course, the online space is a gendered one, just like it is in the off-screen real life reality. The digital violence that women and girls can experience take on various forms. Digital violence against women can include harassment and cyberbullying in the forms of trolling and flaming. Included here is also image-based sexual exploitation, such as revenge pornography. And digital rape and death threats are also common tactics of harassment and abuse against women. And the often graphic and violent language that incels use can be described as a form of e-bile, which is another term for gendered hate speech and vitriol targeting women and girls. And then lastly, incels exist within a larger coalescence of men online termed the manosphere. And this is a loosely defined organization of men who belong to groups like the men's rights activists, the pickup artists, and traditional conservatives. They may all have varying belief systems, but generally speaking, men within the manosphere, including incels, typically blame feminism and distrust and disparage women for apparently taking away men's rights and oppressing men. Also here, I'll provide just a brief conceptual framework through which I observed incels, and this includes hegemonic masculinity, aggrieved entitlement, and patriarchy. So incels, by their own calculations, are unable to exhibit hegemonic masculinity in the traditional sense through physical and sexual attractiveness or other markers of success. And so they have determined that they are less than these overtly masculine and alpha men, whom they blame for being the only kinds or types of men that women find sexually attractive. And then on the other hand, aggrieved entitlement is this idea of feeling entitled to something or someone. In this case, incels feel it is in their right to have access to women's bodies simply because they are men. And when they realize that they cannot have that access, they also feel entitled to these feelings of anger and rage. And then patriarchy is, of course, the larger the larger system of power that sustains and upholds ideas about men's superiority, and this idea underpins much of incel ideology. So I conducted a qualitative content analysis of approximately 250 individual data points, and these consist of direct quotations and screenshots of images and pictures on various incel-specific online forums and chat rooms like incels.co, incel.net, incel.is, and the like. Overall, I did have 5 findings. For the purposes of this presentation and the time limit, I will only be focusing on the first 3. If you have any comments or questions about the last 2 about male victimization and masculinity crises, I welcome any comments or questions. I will leave my information at the end. This is a very short and brief list of some commonly used incel terminology that comes up in my presentation. This is not at all exhaustive, but incel and involuntary celibates call themselves betas, subhumans, subchads. Chads are of course, these alpha masculine men, sort of at the top of this social hierarchy. Normies is everyone else, so people like you and I who don't necessarily fit within these categories. And foid and femoid, you've already seen very derogatory, objectifying terminology for women. So the first finding is that of rape culture, and it's an important foundation for a lot of the violence that occurs within this space, and it frames much of the interactions that incels have among each other and with the larger public. So the first quote reads, "Women want to be whores, to not face the consequences of being whores, and to re-educate all men that there's nothing wrong with them being whores," end quote. The second one says, "Also, the whole rapist problem would get lowered by at least 50% if women stop dressing up like sluts who want to grab attention. Nobody in their right mind will feel bad if a slut like this would get raped if she is unable to prevent, if she cannot prevent it by choosing different clothing. A foid dressed up in a crop top and whore stockings is just screaming rape me." Elements of rape culture were virtually present in all of my data points. And these elements include things like the sexual objectification of women, victim blaming, trivializing sexual and physical harm, and excusing perpetrator behavior. My second finding is that of a promotion of violence against women. So I have 2 slides worth of various quotes, which show examples of what violence against women looks like within the incel community. The first quote says, "Happy to see dead normies, but I hope the next shooter throws in a rape or 2. The second quote says, "I once made a thread asking if committing rape was permissible or understandable if one was not able to find a willing sexual partner." The third quote says, "If you see a drunk girl passed out and no one's around, make sure to cut off her clitoris if you're able," end quote. The last one says, "Foids like getting raped and only pretend to be traumatized when it was done by a sub-8 man. If a Chad did it, nothing will happen to him. Sex is similar to torture on many levels." So obviously this is very disturbing. And although these quotes may not represent the majority of incel discourse within the incel community, this language is massively important when we consider the actual acts of violence that have already happened to women at the hands of incels. For example, Elliot Rodger in California, and Alec Manassian shortly after in Canada. And then finally, sexual entitlement is also important to understand here. And this helps us see why incels are so readily demanding of access to women's bodies and feel that they have a right to use such violent and derogatory language. The first quote says, "Inceldom is worse than rape." Second one says, quote, "I can't imagine living a life where you take sex for granted like that. Meanwhile, I can't get one girl to acknowledge my existence." And the last quote says, "Less men getting sex equals more incels and more justified hatred towards women." So again, sexual entitlement is closely intertwined with incels advocating for violence against women, because when they realize they cannot just have someone simply because they should be allowed to, often the violence serves as a compensatory reaction for the denial of their so-called rights. And in summation, I'll leave you all with just a few points. The first is that sexist and misogynistic language in the form of e-bile serves 2 goals. At least it did so in my research here today. The first is to alienate women from these online spaces. And the second, it serves as compensatory masculinity. Since incels are unable to perform masculinity in a way that is legitimate and valid, they are then pressured or forced to exemplify it in these harmful and often problematic alternative methods. And digital violence against women is not new in its content. This is the same sexism and the same misogyny that we're all familiar with, but it's now taken on a new platform. And then finally, incels represent a microcosm of the misogyny, the harassment, and the violence that women endure in their everyday life experiences. But in this way, incels are an additional puzzle piece to the larger conversations about violence against women that we have already been having. And they should not be excluded in further exploration of cyberspace and the proliferation of violence that occurs there. So thank you all for your attention. And here's my contact information if you happen to have any comments or questions. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Our next paper is It's Over or It's a Miracle. Sarah, whenever you're ready. Sarah, you're muted.
This is the story of my life. 2020. I should just put that on my title slide. I'm sorry, I'm muted. Okay, so I'm excited to be on this panel with everybody, Andy with CrimCon, and everything that you and the board have done. Thank you. This is exciting. I do want to apologize. James Messerschmidt originally started working on this paper with Shon and me, and then had to back out. So I'm sorry that if people came to see Jim Messerschmidt and then are stuck with me. But I think this is a really great kind of follow-up to go. I'm really excited that somebody else is studying incels too. So thanks, Albina. I don't want to get too into the weeds about incels because Albina did such a great job of kind of presenting an overview of this. When I think about involuntary celibacy, though, I think about kind of their own definition of being an incel. So they call it, a person who desires but is unable to be in a romantic relationship. So there's kind of this idea of like self-identified incels with the community versus a situation known as incels. Sorry, that's my cat. I can't do anything about it now. And like Albina said, this is, they view themselves as being a subordinated masculinity within this global hierarchy of hegemonic masculinity. So the things that really keep them from, I think, obtaining any kind of relationship with women, researchers have found this, but also they list 4 main reasons as being their physical appearance, their personality, certain mental health issues like severe anxiety, depression, or autism, and then also missed milestones. So as they miss these milestones, it gets harder for them over time to kind of compensate for them. So they're generally viewed as being a violent, dangerous they've been called domestic terrorists before. And a lot of this is because of their vitriol online and that e-bile that Albina discussed. But one of the issues with how we're understanding incels as it stands now is that there's not a lot of work and research being done with incels directly for obvious reasons. A lot of some journalists have gotten in contact with them, but it's still pretty limited. So this is a very exploratory study. It's introductory in nature. I did interviews with 10 self-proclaimed incels that I contacted via social media or via email. I kind of accidentally encountered an incel, like I emailed someone to ask a question and then we wound up talking, and then I was emboldened. So that's kind of how I got into this. I mostly did interviews via social media messenger, but I did do a few phone calls with people. They're all self-proclaimed incels with varying roles in the incel communities. So one of them is a moderator for a popular incel site. Another one is a famous YouTuber. Another one's a not so famous YouTuber. And then other ones are just kind of people that kind of engage in the forums. So all of the interviews were transcribed and evaluated for kind of initial themes. And then a team of coders, a team of trained coders, we negotiated these themes and then recoded all of the material. I will note that the positionality is important here, that as an Asian woman, Asian women are generally tend to be on the receiving end of a lot of incels vitriol for their alleged race abandonment or race trading. So I think I have to kind of step back and think about how incels may have reacted to me as a result of this, and then just as a self-identified feminist, and how I interpret the things that they've said. I think that's important. So that's something that we negotiated throughout this. And then Shon, who's here now, as we were writing this paper, we kind of negotiated those things as we evaluated and interpreted their work. I do have to say too that there's a sampling issue here, obviously, that only the most, I guess, benevolent or friendly incels are the ones who are willing to talk to me. And so I'm not getting kind of this sample of more vitriolic incels. So this obviously isn't generalizable, but it's an introductory understanding to incel experiences. So across these interviews, I did find that there were 5 specific themes as they relate to hegemonic masculinity and otherwise. So I don't want to kind of read these quotes to you here, but I can tell you just a few things. So with hegemonic masculinity, there was, as Albina found, a lot of like comparing themselves to other men, particularly Chads, and this expression of failure at doing gender, like that missed milestone that I mentioned. I will say also before I continue that the interviewees allowed themselves to, or allowed me to share their names, or they picked what name they wanted me to use. They are kind of expressing though this notion of a subordinated masculinity, and they're not happy about it, to be honest. So as a result, they feel that they are treated very poorly. They are victimized by society and individuals, and excluded from this. They are bullied, often ignored, and mocked. But again, this is their perceptions of it. So, they have a very, they take a victim mentality in this. And the black pill, I could do a whole presentation on the black pill. But this is probably the most controversial among the incels, but they all discussed it. But the general idea here is that looks ruin everything. That because they are physically unattractive, it decreases their chances of ever finding companionship or sex, and nothing can change short of plastic surgery or physically moving to another country. So for some, though, it's an acceptance that they're happier because they realize that it's over. There's nothing they can do to change it. They'll stop trying. This shitposting theme speaks to Albina's work, and that they use this forum as a way of lashing out. So this e-bio, this discursive nature of hegemonic masculinity and reclaiming strength and masculinity through these kind of allow them a place to vent and air their frustration. Other people that have done research on internet communications or internet communities say that shitposting might actually be like a form of play, and creating an in-group and out-group for people that get the joke and people that don't. So the people that are horrified by it on the outside, they're all dumb for not understanding. And then as a result of all this, though, they really are experiencing severe depression, suicidality, and loneliness. A few of them did mention that they had previously been suicidal, but obviously due to research ethics, I can't ask if they're currently suicidal. So what this means for future research is really that we need to engage in research that includes incels, but to do it in a safe way that's safe for researchers and safe for incels too. And it would help to develop quantitative measures. If you've ever been on their forums, one in particular does collect data. They have about a 50% response rate for their surveys. It needs improvement though, and they need to use continuous variables. I've offered to create a survey for them. And then we need to be able to kind of talk about mental health resources to address the stigmatization of inceldom and claiming to be an incel, and to address issues like male gender role status or male gender role stress, a failure to launch, severe self-esteem, being uneducated, not educated, employed or trained. And then really to kind of think about hegemonic masculinity approaches, but also to expand this to other theoretical approaches too, like anomie or strain, or even labeling theory. So feel free to contact Shon or me about this, but thank you.
All right, thank you. Our final paper in this session, exploring the effectiveness of legislation combating digital, non-consensual, sexually explicit image distribution. Tessa, whenever you're ready.
Hi, my name is Tessa Cole, and I am a third year at Georgia State University. Today, I will be discussing revenge porn, specifically the ineffectiveness of non-consensual porn distribution. I know it's a mouthful. That is currently taking place in the United States. My review will highlight the lack of diversity in the use of revenge porn state statutes and the similarities between victims of IPV, intimate partner violence, and non-consensual porn distribution prosecution that leads to negative outcomes for victims. So in order to do this, I will briefly go over definitions, the prevalence of revenge porn, the effects, the current legislation that's in place, some theoretical reasons why we're having issues with revenge porn, with some recommendations for policy changes. So what is porn? Sexually explicit images, photos, videos, and non-consensual porn distribution, commonly known as revenge porn. Not all of it's revenge porn. That's why I typically prefer to refer to it as non-consensual porn distribution, is the spread of porn without the individual featured in the image, photo, or video, their consent. So in 2014, it was estimated that there was about 3,000 porn websites that contained either the category of revenge porn or were just straight up revenge porn websites. The Cyber Civil Rights Initiative found that 10% of individuals in an intimate relationship had threatened to release their significant others' sexually explicit images. And the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative has support from Branch and colleagues who found that 10% of individuals actually admitted to disseminating the sexually explicit images of their partners. And the individuals that have been revenge porned, 93% of them have experienced significant emotional distress, and that it's not only like mentally, that also goes into the physical world. An example of this is how 50% of a little over 1,000 individuals were interviewed that had been revenge porned, and of the 1,000 individuals, 50% of those people had found their names, addresses, cell phone numbers, social media accounts associated with the images that they were featured on. So it's more than just a digital issue we have going on here. So at the time that we conducted our content analysis, before that, we checked with previous research, and we'd found that 78% of states had revenge porn statutes. All of those statutes had issues with jurisdictional prosecution. So if you're in Tennessee revenge porning someone in New Jersey, if Tennessee has a misdemeanor and New Jersey has a felony, who are you going to go with? Are you going with the person that was revenge porned out of the state? Are you going with the person that's revenge porning in the state? So there's just too many issues going on there with how the legislation is written. So in order to explain even more why revenge porn is an issue, if you look at theory, routine activities theory, which was postulated by Cohen and Felsen, says that a crime is able to be committed when an offender a victim and lack of guardianship converge in time and space. And the offender in this case would be the revenge porner. The victim in this case would be the revenge pornee. And then the absence of guardianship is our legislation that we have right now with our internet capabilities. So as I said before, we did a content analysis of the current state statutes, just to make sure that we had caught like every state statute up to that point, because there could be increases, decreases in how states are dealing with revenge porn. Then from there, we used Boolean logic on Westlaw to search to see, of the states that had statutes, what, like if there were cases. And then from there, we assessed, like, of the cases, are there gender differences and who's being prosecuted, found guilty, and that sort of thing. And I'm sorry, I have German Shepherds, I apologize. All right, so we did find that there was one state that updated. So there's 50 states, obviously, and then DC. So DC does have a statute, and New York had come out with a statute in 2019. So like right before we collected all of our data. So it's good. We're moving in the right direction of trying to get everybody on the same page. And we yielded 20 court cases. Of those 20 court cases, only 12 of them went to actually like the next step in the court proceedings. Of the, I apologize, the German Shepherd's distracting me. So of the yielded court cases, did the state have the ability to, oh, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. So of the court cases, the pronoun of the victims, and we went off of what the court said, because if you know, like the way the court rules when it comes to gender and like pronouns, they go off of like the license. So that's how we just like coded it. The findings found that there were more female victims than male, which is very similar to IPV when it comes to the victimization rates there. Was the gender of the perpetrator stated or implied? In 9 of the cases it was. It's important to highlight that 2 of the 9 cases were groups of people. So one of them actually was Backpage that we found. And then the court found 4 of the 20 cases that were yielded guilty, or those perpetrators guilty. I think this is important because oftentimes the reasons why the perpetrator was not found guilty was because the court could not like fully identify the woman featured in, or the woman or man featured in the image. So they needed more than like half the face. And a lot of the cases where the victim was not supported, or the perpetrator was not tried, or was not found guilty. So the current study, it did further the findings of the 2 previous studies, which were there is issues with jurisdictional and also the way the court like sees how like a victim is a victim, like are they showing their full face or not. It is important to highlight that all of the cases that went to trial and the court saw use dissemination as a state statute, not like harassment. And there were 4 types of cases that revenge porn fell underneath in each state that had a statute, which was, as before, you can see in the Boolean logic that we use, like harassment, stalking. And there are very few revenge porn court cases, which is in contrast to how like high the prevalence that's reported. So a lot of these people are just like suffering in silence, and it's perpetual because we know with the internet, once you're victimized again if your picture is still featured. So my recommendations for policy is that the current revenge porn statutes should be removed just completely from each state dealing with it on its own, and federal legislation should be implemented. This is happening with child abuse, so it's kind of confusing why it's not it can't be like implemented with revenge porn. And it also, revenge porn gets a little bit finicky because like there's categories on like Pornhub that like barely legal. Oftentimes those people actually aren't legal, but then the images and the videos are released after they turn 18. So there's a lot of just like gray area, right? With what's going on. So yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for taking your time today. So we have some questions coming in. I'm going to start with the shortest one. Excuse me. So do incels include females, or do they fall into a different category or group? Whoever wants to take it.
Sarah, you can go ahead, and then maybe I can just piggyback.
So for one of the largest incel communities, or two of the largest incel communities, many believe that women cannot be incels because they think that women can go out and have sex anytime they want. They believe this about gay men too, that the gay community is hypersexual. There is one community in particular that does allow women to join, and they are very inclusive of women and the LGBT community.
Yeah, and I found very similar interactions online. The chat rooms that I've been on, you actually have to sort of abide by the rules determined by them. So there are several that are like, you are not a female, you are not a woman, and you have to check off the box, right? But the interesting thing is that the origins of inceldom were started by a woman. It looks very different today than it did. I think it was started in the 1990s. But so the origins is from a woman who wanted to create this community of people who all were experiencing the same sort of life without a companion. And of course, that has now been perverted to what it is today, or changed, I should say. But yeah, females, like Sarah said, they're not particularly welcomed within their organization.
Thank you. Sarah, the next question is for you. They write, how did you identify your participants? I know they are self-identified incels, but what did you look for or search for in order to identify and decide to reach out to them?
Sure. So like I said, I accidentally kind of stumbled upon the first one, that there was a paper online that I found that an incel had written, and I had an email address. So I just emailed him, was like, can I ask you a few things? From there, I started following a few on Twitter, just Twitter being what it is. If you follow one person, you get similar recommendations. And I've kind of decided to reach out based on their posts if they discuss inceldom. I found a few on YouTube that had email addresses and contact information. And then for a few, I got through snowball sampling, that they shared my information with other people. They were weirdly protective of me sharing my information. I did ask if they would maybe tell other people or if they would post about it in the forums with my Discord information. And two of them said, that's not a good idea. Let's not do that. So I appreciated that in a sense.
Thank you. So let me see here. So one more incel question from Rebecca Steinberg. This is a long question, so bear with me. As I think about incels, the definition and categorization, it seems a lot like how gang members are identified or classified by self-identification and labeling. We see gang enhancements in adjudication of related cases. Could you see related enhancements or moderated or mitigated sentences in terms of a related criminal activity by incels? I'm curious if any of you have seen these identities or their online presence and dialogues and threats as being used as mitigating or aggravating factors in court cases.
Albina, if you want to talk, or Shon.
Sure, yeah, I think that they're discussed as aggravating factors. I mean, especially some of the stuff that's happened in Canada fairly recently. Online postings and, online identities have been discussed like that. It's just, with incels, it's very interesting in the ways in which they like accept and reject people from their community. I mean, I know Sarah can talk about that too, but like some people, like, you know, the Toronto van shooter, stuff in California, like some accept it, some of it's kind of turned into a meme. It's kind of weird the ways in which that goes. So I think it kind of gets muddied up in the courts a bit, but I think there's definitely a push to use those identities as such.
Yeah, Canada just recently passed legislation that incel-related crimes are considered hate crimes. So the few attacks they had earlier this year are being prosecuted as such. I don't know that necessarily it's going to be a deterrent, though, for people, because for incels and other mass shooters, they may already be suicidal anyway. And even for the few incel attacks that there have been, or incel adjacent attacks, both in the US and in Canada, they've been kind of loosely connected to incel groups. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily something we need to be considering.
A follow-up question that just came in: is there any research that investigates their perceptions of being prosecuted? Ivan, I'm assuming you're asking this about incels.
Oh, not that I know of, no.
Okay. So Tessa, Frank Plunkett has 2 questions for you. First, he asks, do you believe that the creation of a federal statute would be a better response than relying on states, or would we be better off if states agreed on a single model statute for state prosecution?
I think the creation of a federal, just in model it very similar to child abuse, because clearly at the federal level, we have agents and organizations that are able to somewhat better handle and deal with child porn cases than, I mean, it's more general, like the laws, it's it's straightforward, and there's more resources. So because of that, it just makes more sense versus it is state to state. And like, then you get counties involved that have no idea even like some of these investigators how to use the internet or what's Instagram. So I've run into some of that with some of my communications with some people online. So
yeah. And Frank's second question, which I think you might have addressed a little bit, he asks, considering the Wild West atmosphere of the internet, how effective are laws at controlling this type of crime?
Horrible. I mean, the only law that I really have to go off of that's been somewhat effective are child abuse legislation. And I mean, because of that, I don't know how we can keep creating these state statutes that are ineffective. There have been some states that have, there have been some courts that have tried to use like stalking laws to combat revenge porn, but they've all been ineffective because we did research that. So as of October 3rd, 2019, none of the stalking cases were effective at actually prosecuting the perpetrator for a revenge porn issue. If the perpetrator was convicted with stalking, it was typically something that they did in the so like the address, that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. A couple more questions for you. So do you have any sense of how many of these states have alternative statutes such as harassment that could be used to prosecute these cases? Yeah,
so actually when we were coding, a lot of the states had, I think it was here. We asked, did the state have a revenge porn statute to prosecute the perpetrator? Some of them have it listed as harassment, violation of property, and then there were several that was like unlawful publication. All of those states that had that did not have any cases that actually went to court. Only the states that had a statute named dissemination/disclosure of an intimate image had cases that went to court. So I think that that's pretty important to note that they specifically are targeting that versus just like general harassment online.
And then do you know how many states roughly have had to rewrite or redo their attempts at passing like revenge porn laws because they're being ruled as unconstitutional?
I don't off the top of my head, but I do know that majority of the statutes that we looked up had been updated since the original enactment.
All right, thank you. And then last question, I'm sorry, Shelley, I didn't see it in the chat. For Sarah and Shon, do you know, is there any themes in relation to geography in your work? Sarah, you're muted.
The cat's meowing, the dogs are barking. This is a lot.
This is the first session I've had today with animals in attendance. And I think like at the next CrimCon, if we really want to like max out Zoom's capacity, we should have a session that's just called like, who's a good boy? And have people just come and let their animals go wild. I think it would be like easily the most well-attended thing that we do. A good fundraiser.
Absolutely. Yeah, just we all hold up our animals. So geographically, the incels from this study, the 10 of them, are from all over the world. One is from Australia, a few are from the US. One is actually very close to me geographically. So there's a large representation or a large portion of the incel community that's in Europe and Canada, and a lot are from the Middle East too, and India. And Asian countries, but there is the primary ones that, you know, I'm looking at, and I'm sure Albina is too, are run in English. So I think that affects the sampling, but there are incel communities and online forums in other countries, including like France, Germany, Japan's dealing with hikikomori, which is a different iteration, but kind of the same thing as incels. So yeah, they're all over the place.
All right, thank you. So seeing no more questions, I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you again, everybody, for coming out today. Thank you to all of our panelists on a fantastic job. Thank you for everybody in attendance. Hey, if you are planning to stick around for the 2 p.m. session, I'm going to be closing this webinar for recording purposes, and it'll be relaunched about 2 o'clock Eastern time. So thanks again, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Enjoy the conference.